This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 161 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Sometimes it's impossible to have answers in fantasy football. It's not like me, JJ, a fantasy football analyst, has some sort of direct intel with a team that no one else has. I'm getting my news the same way that you guys are. And that's what makes the Le'Veon Bell situation so tough. Let me first address the elephant in the room, which is that I was wrong earlier in the offseason. My thoughts on Le'Veon Bell and the contract situation is that it made the most logical sense for him to report to the team as he did last year, because if he didn't, he was forfeiting over $800,000 per game. If he didn't sign his contract through the first 10 weeks of the season, he'd be foregoing over $8 million. And that's a lot of cash to walk away from. I understand the argument that he's playing for a future contract, so he's trying to save his body. And I'll almost always side with the player in these instances. I want what's best for the player, not the team. But my thought was that what's honestly best for Le'Veon Bell is to play the season, make the money that he would make on the franchise tag, and then get a new deal the following year. And my thought hasn't really changed. I think that's the path that makes the most sense. Because if he's trying to not wear down his body in order to get a lucrative guaranteed deal in 2019, are 9 or 10 games going to make a difference? Are teams going to look at a deal differently? Would they shave that deal by more than $8 million? But I think there's more to this too. Le'Veon Bell and his agent made it fairly clear that he would report and be active for week 1, which is why you're seeing Steelers players react the way they reacted this week when he didn't report. It's just been a really odd approach to say one thing and then do another. And Bell and his agent have every right to do that. I'm just saying that's the main reason these players are upset. They were expecting one thing and something else happened. But like I said, I think there's more to this. What happens if James Conner steps in and dominates in Bell's absence? All of a sudden, it makes it seem like Le'Veon Bell's impact on the Steelers really isn't that big. Couldn't that alter the way a future team views him? And what happens if the teams view this Le'Veon Bell circus as a negative? What if they're completely turned off by the way that he's being represented? And even the way that he's representing himself? Again, I want what's best for the player here. I want what's best for Le'Veon Bell. But I don't think it's as simple as he's not running his body into the ground, and I sincerely hope that his agent and Bell did the math to understand the payoff. I hope the payoff is there. All of this is to say that when I get questions about what to do with Le'Veon Bell in fantasy football, I don't have any better answer than you do. There are so many things happening with this story, and while I can think critically about it and give an opinion on the situation, my opinion is meaningless when it comes to whether or not Bell will play. Do I think he should? Yes, and for his benefit. Do I think he will? At this point, I'm not very confident that he'll be working with the Steelers until later this season. I have Le'Veon Bell in 3 leagues. One of them I have James Conner, but one of them I don't, and the other is a dynasty format, so that sort of gets thrown out the window. But in the league where I have Le'Veon Bell and not James Conner, I'm looking to trade for Conner because I do believe that he has high-end RB2 upside if Le'Veon Bell is sidelined. I mean, I think that you could look to trade for James Conner regardless if you have Le'Veon Bell or not. All of this could change in an instant, though. That's the thing. It all comes down to your risk tolerance. I had people asking me what kind of trade value Le'Veon Bell has right now, and the answer is that there's absolutely not going to be a consensus way to view Le'Veon Bell in fantasy football. It's literally impossible. We have no idea when he's going to report. It's all about how much risk you're looking to add to your team. I'm fairly risk averse, so I'm not actively going after Le'Veon Bell. And I'm even open to selling him in the league that I was just talking about. It just depends on your preference. There's no singular answer with Le'Veon Bell because there can't be a singular answer with Le'Veon Bell. Questions around Bell were easily the most common for this week's Mailbag show, but we've got a lot more to go through. Before digging through them though, I wanted to let you guys know about NumberFire Premium. With award-winning daily fantasy tools, survivor pool picks, gambling predictions, and premium content from our top experts, NumberFire Premium has everything you need to dominate in 2018. Best of all, Late Round Podcast listeners get their first month of any level of premium access for just $9.99 with promo code CHAMPION. For more info, visit numberfire.com/premium. That's numberfire.com/premium. This first question is from @CaptainDonut. Atlanta Freeman owner. Would you trade Rex Burkhead for Tevin Coleman? My running backs are DJ, Freeman, Rex, Williams, and Murray. No, you don't want to do this. I'm not a running back handcuffer at the beginning of a season, and I'm certainly not a running back handcuffer when that handcuff is costly. If you do this trade, you may never hypothetically start both Coleman and Freeman, but there may be a scenario where you wish you would have kept Burkhead because starting both Coleman and Freeman doesn't usually bring forth success in fantasy football. I talked about this before on my podcast, but Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman have played 35 games together over the last 3 years, and this excludes week 17 in the playoffs. They've both finished as a top 24 PPR running back in just 5 of those games. So only 5 of 35 games, both Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman finished as a usable top 24 PPR asset at the running back position together. So in other words, you're not going to have multiple running backs in your team giving you RB2 performances if you have to start both of those guys. And Rex Burkhead has a great ceiling this year, so you're giving up a good bit just to get a costly handcuff. I don't mind having Tevin Coleman on my team, I would just rather have him without Freeman. And I've got plenty of Devontae Freeman too. I just don't want them together because it limits my upside at running back. So this next question actually plays off nicely to the previous one, and it's one that I get a lot. It's from @RyanPollock5. Do you find extra value in owning a backfield? For example, picking a backfield that consistently produces at the running back position, I find myself rostering Burkhead, Michel, or Williams and Jones. I figure that one back from those situations will have high RB2 upside. Thanks. So I don't usually draft multiple players from one backfield because it generally doesn't pan out. There was a great study on this done by Justin Freeman on NumberFire this offseason, and his conclusion was just that. Pick one guy in the backfield, but not the whole backfield. You guys can read that by Googling the title of the article, which is, Can You Gain an Edge in Fantasy Football by Collecting Entire Backfields? But I think there's often a lot of bias when we look at things this way. It's similar to handcuffing. We often remember when handcuffs pan out, like D'Angelo Williams a couple years ago, or maybe even Michael Bush even longer ago, but there are so many instances where handcuffs don't work out. And the same goes with this. You should be targeting running backs in ambiguous backfields who are also in good offenses because those are the backs who generally emerge in fantasy football. I talked about that on my Spotting a Breakout Running Back podcast earlier this offseason. But there are a ton of running back clusters that just never work out. They just end up in running back by committee systems. And not only that, owning so many running backs from the same team will still limit your overall upside because that team can only score so many points. That's similar to the Freeman-Coleman example that I just walked through. So the answer is no, I don't own a backfield. I take plenty of shots at questionable backfields, but I never get every single back from a single backfield. It's usually a move with a negative expected outcome. This next question is from @RamsToddFather. How do you feel about Baldwin's health short and long term? Someone to trade for or trade away? So a few people actually responded to this question and said that they also wanted it answered, and since I love you guys so much, I figured that I'd give it a whirl. My final rankings and tiers update had Doug Baldwin at wide receiver 20 given the news surrounding his knee. If he was 100% healthy, I'd have Doug Baldwin at about wide receiver 12. If you drafted Doug Baldwin, you just hold on to Doug Baldwin. Chances are you're not going to get fair value right now given the news surrounding his knee. But hopefully that ranking gives you guys some context. Where I have Baldwin ranked, he's in that Golden Tate or Josh Gordon range. There's risk involved with Baldwin, but I do believe that he's still going to see a ton of volume this year, and he can finish as a solid wide receiver too. But it's impossible to know given we've yet to see him play with this knee injury. This next question is from @FFMJ18. Thoughts on Mike Gillislee? Anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I was very into drafting Jonathan Williams with an end of draft pick this year, but it had nothing to do with the player and everything to do with the situation. The Saints are without Mark Ingram for 4 games, and they get the Bucs and the Browns in weeks 1 and 2. There's a good chance for a super positive game script in both of those games, and given they were fairly run-heavy last year and split their backfield up, that means the number 2 back in this Saints offense would and should probably see some work. That's now Mike Gillislee. Just replace Jonathan Williams and throw in Mike Gillislee, who's probably more talented. Kamara will see an uptick in volume from last year, but Gillislee could be a strong option for teams who are desperate in weeks 1 and 2. They literally don't have anyone else to go to in order to give Kamara any sort of break. So I like Mike Gillislee, and I would roster him if you got an easy player to drop on your roster. This next question is from @DevyDistributor. Based on all the target competition in New York now, do you still consider OBJ to be an elite asset this year? Ingram, Barkley, and even Shepard will probably draw some more looks than previous years, right? So volume matters most in fantasy football, but elite players like Odell Beckham don't see their target shares drastically change from one year to the next. When they're as good as OBJ, the percentage of targets doesn't change. Now, where I think you could maybe make the argument is in the touchdown column. From 2014 through 2016, so Beckham's healthy seasons, the Giants scored 43, 41, and 32 offensive touchdowns. In 2 of those seasons, 2015 and 2016, they combined for just 11 rushing touchdowns. That means that a lot of their touchdowns were skewed to be of the passing variety. So maybe they change things up when they're close to the goal line now that they have Saquon Barkley, and then OBJ scores 2 or 3 fewer times than we typically see from him. But that doesn't really make him less valuable from a season-long perspective. His outlook is still that of a top 5 wideout. This next question is from @Where is the Kiwi? How do you compare a bottom of a roster running back or wide receiver versus players on the waiver wire, especially in shallow leagues? If you're in a shallow league, that means there are probably plenty of options on your waiver wire each week. So that means I'm definitely utilizing the end of my bench with super high upside players rather than a floor guy. I don't need Theo Riddick types. I don't need Giovanni Bernard types. I'd rather have someone like Jordan Wilkins. That's generally my philosophy in most leagues, but with deeper formats, you sometimes have to go with a little bit of a higher floor player on your bench just for some safety. This next question is from @TealTimmy. Who are some guys on most waiver wires you were intrigued to see play this week? One is definitely Traquan Smith. I want to see how the Saints utilize their pass catchers in a plus matchup, and it's really a game where Drew Brees could go off. Smith was my 16th transaction on this week's 15 transaction show, and there's a chance that he's one of the hotter waiver wire ads after week 1. There's also Mike Gillislee from the same game and team. The secondary wide receivers for the Chargers, I think, are pretty intriguing. James Washington for Pittsburgh. Ricky Seals-Jones is another guy I'm pretty high on. There are a lot of players that I think could be popular waiver wire ads in week 2. Those are just a handful of them. This next one's from @Eric Belair. Any early week 2 streaming picks if you have a bench spot to burn? Just giving next week's schedule a quick glance, Alex Smith gets the Colts, so he'd be a good one if he's available. And then also I think that Case Keenum could be in play against the Raiders. Defensively, it's actually pretty tough. Hopefully you were able to just draft a defense like New Orleans, but maybe like Cincinnati if they're available because they get Baltimore at home. The Jets are at home against Miami. Maybe that's a play, but there really aren't a lot of obvious defenses at first glance. This last question from @FirstNameDamon. Should I care about my Yahoo draft grade? Ha ha ha. So I know these sites grade your teams, and people always end up hitting me up in a panic after their draft concludes, wondering if they did something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. Those grades are based on season-long projections, and they make a lot of assumptions about how your team is going to perform. They're fun and they're perfect for casual drafters, and while I know you're just messing around with this question, please everyone, don't take those grades seriously. That's going to be it for today's Mailbag show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. You can submit mailbag questions there each and every week. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the first Sunday of the regular season, and let's win some fantasy matchups.